Nairobi has transformed the former site of the U.S. Embassy into a memorial park and includes a wall and grave with the names of the victims. Attending a ceremony in Washington, a former U.S. ambassador to Kenya warned that embassies around the world still remain at risk 2 decades later. Peter Vincent is a global security expert. He previously served as a counter-terrorism official with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. He's kind enough to join us here. And Peter, I know that you were in Kenya recently. How has the country kind of changed? How's the dynamic changed? Because I know you're working with counterterrorism people there. I mean, it's a different country now, isn't it, 20 years later?
It really is. Of course, today we are celebrating the horrific 20th anniversary of the attack in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. And I was in Kenya twice this summer, in May and just last week, working with Kenyan counterterrorism prosecutors. And if anything, their job has gotten even more difficult. Of course, with the attacks on the embassy in Dar es Salaam and Nairobi, Kenya, we first solidified the reputation of Al-Qeada as the most fearsome, well-organized, and lethal terrorist organization in the world. Since then, an Al-Qaeda Somali affiliate, Al-Shabaab, has gained a great deal of attention and attraction by engaging in horrific acts in Kenya and Somalia.
You say it's more difficult. I mean, they sense that, don't they?
They do sense that. There is a palpable fear, in particular, of Al-Shabaab in Kenya. The Kenyan border with Al-Shabaab is quite porous. Al-Shabaab is well organized, they're well financed, and they have declared war on Kenya since 2011 when the Kenyan Defense Forces officially entered Somalia to fight Al-Shabaab.
20 years, I mean, it's a long period of time. Things have certainly changed. I mean, Al-Qaeda at that time, who are these guys? Now you're talking about Al-Shabaab, we're talking about ISIS. How's the landscape changed over the last 20 years? One would think that we've improved in some ways, but we've kind of taken steps backwards as well.
We have learned our lessons, and the Kenyan Defense Forces in particular, working with the United States, have really perfected its ability to get good intelligence on terrorist organizations operating in the Horn of Africa. But it's more complicated because you have a more diverse and in some ways much more complicated organizational structure that you're trying to deal with now. Whereas Al-Qaeda was a very hierarchical organization, Al-Shabaab is not as hierarchical, and it's impossible to fully know who's in charge and what cells are operating and where they're operating.
And it's whack-a-mole in a sense, too, because I know talking to you and other counterterrorism people, you know, like Al-Qaeda may fade from the headlines, but that doesn't mean they're gone. ISIS, the same story, Al-Shabaab. And it's really kind of hard to stay on top of this, isn't it?
Precisely, Mike. I mean, we saw great victories against the so-called Islamic State, rooting them out of places like Iraq and Syria. But the intellectual, the emotional caliphate exists, although the geographical, physical caliphate does not. It still exists as an inspiration and a motivator to individuals that want to carry out acts of terror. So it's become much more complicated. The Islamic State is looking for safe operational space. They're, in fact, back in Afghanistan, and they're becoming much more strong there. And of course, Al-Shabaab is gaining in strength as well in the Horn of Africa.
And some of the things that you've been on our broadcast in the past we've talked about, you know, you can fortify an embassy, and yet terrorist attacks can happen in markets in Germany. We've seen that. We've seen these in different places. It can be a truck just driving through and mowing people down.
Yeah, we've seen that in France. We've seen that in Germany, holiday markets that were attacked in the relatively recent history. And as hard as you fortify certain targets like embassies or like official government ministerial buildings, terrorists are unfortunately very savvy and very sophisticated and very adroit, and they will look to exploit those soft targets where they can maximize the number of individuals killed and also gain a great deal of news coverage in order to fill their ranks with adherents.
We've got about 30 seconds. What keeps you up at night? Somebody who's in this field.
What keeps me up is the continued growth of the so-called Islamic State and Al-Qaeda outside their normal operating areas. So we've seen a move out of Syria and Iraq. We've seen a move into places like Mindanao in southern Philippines. That's what makes me nervous. And I worry that in Afghanistan, the Islamic State will gain a foothold and a safe operational space and will be further empowered.
Well, it's going to keep people like you busy, I'm sure. Thank you so much, Peter. Always a pleasure seeing you. Thanks for coming in.